In HeavyBid, there are two ways of calculating the cost of the labor burden. The first two versions of HeavyBid, the basic and the advanced, has a tax and a fringe where you have a tax rate for each labor code, and then you have a fringe which is $1 per hour. And this works for many of the situations that companies come across, but when you're dealing with many unions and then you get into the different union rules, that just doesn't quite meet the requirements in getting accurate costs and an estimate. So we have another method which is available in the comprehensive version, and that's called Comprehensive Labor Work Rules. So first of all, what you want to do is set it up so that the estimate can activate these work rules, and that's under Tools, Preferences, and then Data Entry Rules, and there'll be a box there which you check off that activates the labor work rules. Now underneath will appear, when you check that box, an option to calculate workers' comp on base burden only. If it's unchecked, it's calculating it on the gross wages, and if it's checked, it's calculating it on base burden only. So you need to decide what applies to your state. Some states do it on gross, some do it on the base or the straight time wage for workers' comp. So I go ahead and click OK. And then I come into where I go to the labor setup, and then set up overtime, and then to set up burden tables. Here's an example of the operator union. And first of all, you notice now that I can have up to 4 different overtime rules for each table. So I can have a standard, and then I can even have its own overtime rule for the second shift, third, and fourth. Now, of course, a lot of times these will be the same work rule, but it does allow you some customization within the unions. Now we come over to the actual burden table. This is much different than, you notice this is much more detailed. Even though you do see the different breakouts, I have a lot more options over here on the right than I did in the simplified version of the labor burdens calculations. So typically you set up your federal and state unemployment first. And let's look at the options here. You have tax percentage. That would be what our federal taxes would be based on. I also have a percent fringe. So even though these would calculate the same, this would put the percentage fringe over in another column as opposed to this percent tax. Plus, if you're calculating it on base wage or gross wages, this could make a difference in your calculation. Now, the $1 per hour would be your typical fringe. But then you have a $1 per base hour, where the fringe would be based only on the base hour or the straight time hour, and then you have a fringe that occurs only in the overtime situation. And then you have the bonus hour at the bottom, where you would be working for, let's say, an off shift, and they would get a bonus hour. So here we have 7.65. That would apply to all of my 4 shifts. And of course, you can't apply tax because this is a tax. I can apply it though where it does apply to overtime. In this case, this would apply to overtime, and whether or not this applies on the workers' comp. And typically that would not be on workers' comp. Then I have my unemployment, 2%. This is probably a health or insurance. It's $1 per hour. And you notice it does apply the overtime to this 0.35. So in an overtime situation, they would this 35 cents would get the increase or the overtime factor of whatever that is. Let's say for a 50-hour calendar, that would be a 1.1 maybe. Welfare, you notice no taxes, all shifts, apprentice training, no workers' comp, but it does apply the taxes and the overtime to the apprentice training. And then in the more burden, I have set up 2 vacations. One's on the base on your base calendar, your base hour, you'd get $1, but then in the overtime situation, you reduce it down to 50 cents. And this is fairly typical in some of the unions. Now you notice in the overtime, it doesn't apply to the first shift, but it would apply to the next 3 shifts. So again, you can customize these burdens to what shifts those occur in. Same thing, you notice I have plenty of room here to add more of my burdens. I even have a 3rd tab. So you can really break down each cost component for each of these tables. Now when I'm done setting up these tables, and you notice I have 4 of them set up, it's just a matter of going back into the labor setup and actually coming over here and applying the labor table to whatever union that you want to apply them to. And obviously you would fill out this whole labor setup with a labor burden. In this way, your estimate is much more accurate in terms of labor burden costs in the project.